The smell of hospital-grade bleach was so thick, it burned the back of Marissa's throat. But it was the silence of her own home that truly choked her. She stood in the center of her kitchen, staring at the empty shelves where her life used to be, until her gaze landed on her mother-in-law's tablet lying forgotten on the counter. An accidental tap on the screen didn't reveal a recipe or a family photo. Instead, it flickered to life with a grid of grainy, high-definition video feeds. From a bird's-eye view, Marissa saw herself standing in the kitchen, her every panicked breath captured in real time from a camera hidden in the smoke detector. As she scrolled back through the footage, her blood turned to ice. It wasn't just the kitchen. There was the hallway, the living room, and a camera angled directly at the pillows of her marriage bed. The audio hissed with the sound of her own private whispers from the night before. Secrets she had only ever shared with her husband under the safety of the covers. A floorboard creaked behind her, and the reflection in the tablet screen showed Gloria standing in the doorway, her shadow stretching long and jagged across the sterile floor. A set of heavy brass keys dangling from her fingers with a rhythmic, metallic chime. Ux, the heavy leather strap of her work bag dug into Marissa Hill's shoulder, a persistent ache that synchronized with the rhythmic throb in her temples. Each step up the creaking wooden stairs of the South Side apartment building felt like a mountain climb, her legs heavy with the residual exhaustion of 8 hours spent managing 30 energetic 8th graders. Behind her closed eyelids, the shrill, metallic ring of the final school bell continued to echo, a sharp contrast to the chaotic shouts of children spilling out into the Chicago streets. Her fingers, pale and trembling slightly from a day of clutching chalk and grading pens, fumbled with the keys in the dim hallway light. She leaned her forehead against the cool, painted wood of the doorframe for a fleeting second, drawing in a shaky breath. In her mind, she already inhabited the next hour. The relief of kicking off those restrictive heels, the sinking into the familiar, sagging depths of the sofa, and David's warm, steady presence beside her. She imagined the soft glow of the floor lamp, the smell of home, and a silence so profound it would finally drown out the lesson plans and administrative reports cluttering her brain. Marissa swung the door open, her lungs expanding in anticipation of the comforting, domestic sense that usually defined her sanctuary. The lingering sweetness of vanilla candles, or the earthy richness of roasted coffee. Instead, a sharp, chemical front slammed into her, an invisible wall of caustic air that made her eyes water instantly. The acrid stench of bleach was so thick it felt tangible, a cold fire that raced down her throat and settled in her lungs. She pressed a frantic palm against her mouth, stifling a jagged cough as her body recoiled from the sterile intrusion. This wasn't the smell of a home. It was the suffocating, impersonal aroma of a surgical ward. Moving into the hallway, she noted the linoleum tiles underfoot. They didn't just look clean. They gleamed with a frightening, unnatural brilliance, reflecting the overhead light like a sheet of ice. The air felt heavy and slick with disinfecting agents, a suffocating blanket of purity that seemed to push the very walls inward. Every trace of their life, the dust of the city, the scent of their shared meals, had been scrubbed away, replaced by this blinding, hospital-grade emptiness. Gloria Hill stood at the far end of the narrow corridor, her small frame rendered imposing by her rigid posture. She remained perfectly still, arms crossed over her chest, a silent sentinel carved from granite. The harsh yellow light of the ceiling fixture pooled in the hollows of Gloria's cheeks and glinted off her glasses, masking her eyes in a predatory sheen. As Marissa took a tentative step forward, Gloria's gaze began a slow, clinical descent, scanning Marissa from the messy strands of her chestnut hair down to the scuffed toes of her shoes. A corner of Gloria's thin, pale lips twitched upward, not in a greeting, but in a flicker of visible distaste. Without moving her body, Gloria extended a long, dry finger toward Marissa's head, then pointed to a smudge of white chalk dust marring the shoulder of her dark blazer. Gloria spoke with a measured, rhythmic precision, savoring the weight of each word as she remarked that in a respectable household, a wife should not permit herself to look like an exhausted street peddler. Marissa froze, the heat of a sudden, humiliated flush creeping up her neck, her exhaustion curdling into a familiar, helpless shame. Driven by a desperate need for something familiar, Marissa retreated into the kitchen. She reached toward the wooden shelf where her jars of aromatic curry and smoked paprika usually sat, the vibrant colors of her cooking life. Her fingers met only smooth, empty air. The spices were gone, replaced by rows of identical white plastic containers, each labeled in Gloria's impeccable, terrifyingly neat calligraphy. Panic rising, Marissa yanked open the cupboard where she kept her favorite ceramic mugs, the ones with the tiny cracks and the mismatched glazes that felt right in her hands. They had vanished. In their place stood a set of cold, translucent bone china, arranged with such mathematical precision they looked like a museum display. Marissa's breath hitched as she began a frantic search, her eyes darting to the trash bin as if she might find the shards of her personality discarded there. All the while, Gloria stood at the counter, her back to Marissa, rhythmically wiping a spotlessly clean surface with a dry cloth. She ignored Marissa's presence entirely, her silence a more potent weapon than any shout, leaving Marissa standing in the middle of her own kitchen, feeling like a ghost. The sound of the front door opening signaled David's return, and Marissa nearly tripped over her own feet to reach him. He was already loosening his tie, his face etched with the weariness of a long day at the IT firm. But Marissa couldn't wait. She began a whispered, frantic litany of the changes in the kitchen, her words tripping over each other in her haste to explain the violation of their space. David didn't react with the outrage she expected. Instead, he placed his large, soft hands on her shoulders, a gesture that felt more like a restraint than an embrace. His eyes didn't meet hers. They drifted over her head to where Gloria had appeared in the kitchen doorway, her expression suddenly shifting to one of weary, selfless devotion. David's voice was low, a soothing murmur that cut through Marissa's protests. He suggested that perhaps Marissa should be more grateful, noting how hard Gloria had worked all day to improve their living conditions. He reached out to smooth a stray lock of Marissa's hair, his touch patronizing, as if he were calming a temperamental child. He added that this level of cleanliness was exactly what their home had been lacking. Marissa felt his words sink into her chest like lead weights, a cold barrier rising between them that no amount of love could easily breach. Dinner was a silent, choreographed performance of power. As they moved to the small kitchen table, Marissa reached for her usual chair at the head, the spot she always occupied, the one that gave her a view of the whole room. Before she could pull it out, Gloria's hand shot forward, her fingers like iron talons as she gripped the edge of Marissa's dinner plate. With a sharp, decisive clatter, Gloria slid the plate to the very end of the table, the seat closest to the exit, tucked into the cramped corner by the refrigerator. Gloria stated firmly that order in a home began with the proper distribution of places, and that from now on, Marissa would sit there. Marissa's eyes flew to David, a silent plea for him to say something, anything, to reclaim their territory. David, however, was intently focused on the mound of mashed potatoes on his plate, his fork moving with mechanical precision as he avoided her gaze. Gloria smoothed her linen napkin over her lap with the air of a conquering general. Marissa sank onto the edge of the designated chair, feeling like an intruder at her own table, while Gloria regally poured the tea, her movements controlling the flow of the evening and the very air in the room. Later, seeking a moment of peace, Marissa wandered into the living room, The space was draped in deep shadows, the only light the grayish gloom filtering through the thin curtains. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of her home. But her hips suddenly collided with a sharp, unyielding wooden corner. A jolt of white-hot pain tore through her side, forcing a gasp from her lungs as she stumbled. Towering before her was the massive oak dresser that had lived in the far corner of the bedroom for years. Gloria had somehow moved the Herculean weight into the dead center of the living room, effectively barricading the path to the sofa. Marissa reached out, her fingers tracing the cold, polished wood in disbelief. It seemed impossible that a woman of Gloria's age and stature could have shifted such a behemoth alone. In the oppressive silence of the apartment, the only sound was the triumphant, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Marissa realized then that the house was no longer a home. It was a shifting maze, a series of traps designed by Gloria to ensure that Marissa never felt sure of her footing again. Gloria leaned over the table, the overhead light catching the lenses of her glasses and turning them into twin opaque discs that hid her eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, was a soft, conspiratorial crawl. She asked Marissa how that unfortunate business with the defiant eighth grader and the principal's threats had turned out. Marissa froze, her fork halfway to her mouth, a sudden chill racing down her spine that had nothing to do with the drafty windows. She had shared that story with David only the night before, whispering it into the crook of his neck while they were huddled under the blankets in the absolute privacy of their bedroom. It was a vulnerable admission of professional failure, meant for him alone. David suddenly developed a persistent cough, his spoon clinking loudly against the side of his mug as he stirred his tea with frantic intensity. He wouldn't look at Marissa, his entire posture shrinking into his shoulders. Gloria watched them both, a faint, knowing smile playing on her thin lips, confirming Marissa's worst fear. There were no more secrets, and even the air between their sheets was being harvested for ammunition. The next evening, Marissa collapsed onto the sofa, her body aching with a fatigue that felt more psychological than physical. Her hand brushed against something hard and smooth, wedged deep between the cushions. She pulled it out, finding Gloria's sleek, matte-finished tablet. Her thumb brushed the sensor by accident, and the screen erupted into a cold, neon-blue glow that stung her eyes. Marissa's heart stuttered in her chest. The display was a grid of 8 razor-sharp video feeds. In the top left square, she saw her own back as she sat on the sofa. The second showed the empty, gleaming hallway. The third focused on the kitchen, the light glinting off the rack of knives Gloria had so carefully arranged. The images flickered with a slight digital lag, documenting every inch of the apartment in real time. A cold sweat broke out along Marissa's spine, her skin crawling with the realization that every private sigh and every weary slump of her shoulders had been recorded. She was no longer a resident. She was a specimen in a digital cage, her every movement curated by the woman in the next room. Marissa tilted her head back, trying to massage the throbbing pain behind her eyes, when a tiny, unnatural glint caught the light. It was nestled deep within the intricate swirls of the plaster molding above the bedroom door. Her breath hitched. She dragged a heavy kitchen stool over, her heart hammering against her ribs, and stood on her tiptoes to peer into the white floral ornament. There, tucked between the plaster petals of a rose, was a microscopic glass lens. A wave of physical nausea rolled through her. This tiny, unblinking black eye had been watching them sleep, watching them dress, witnessing the most intimate, vulnerable moments of her marriage. The plastic casing felt icy against her fingertips as she touched it. A permanent, invasive parasite embedded in the very bones of her sanctuary. Gloria hadn't just cleaned the house. She had converted it into a high-tech observation deck. turning Marissa's life into a perverse reality show for an audience of one. The psychological siege intensified the following morning. Gloria walked to the dining table and, with a dry, papery rustle, slid a printed sheet of paper across the polished wood, stopping it directly in front of David's plate. Marissa leaned over, her stomach dropping. It was a graining, high-contrast still from one of the cameras. It showed Marissa's face, distorted by weeping, her mouth open in a silent sob as she held her phone to her ear. Gloria's voice was a mournful whisper as she pointed out the timestamp. 2:30 in the morning. She spoke of secret late-night attachments and clandestine emotional outbursts to strangers, her tone dripping with feigned concern. Marissa tried to speak, her throat tight with a rising sob, wanting to explain it was a call to a colleague for support. But the image was damning in its lack of context. It didn't record the words, only the appearance of guilt. She watched David's jaw tighten, the muscles working under his skin as a dark, uncharacteristic jealousy, fueled by his mother's poison, began to cloud his eyes. Desperation flared in Marissa's chest. She lunged forward, her hand outstretched to snatch the tablet from Gloria's grasp. But the older woman's reflexes were predatory. Gloria's hand shot out, her fingers, surprisingly strong and as hard as bird talons, clamping around Marissa's wrist with bruising force. Marissa let out a sharp cry of pain as Gloria's manicured nails bit deep into the tender skin of her inner arm. Gloria didn't let go. She leaned in, her face inches from Marissa's, her eyes two chips of frozen gray. She held the grip for several long, agonizing seconds before finally releasing her. Marissa stumbled back, clutching her arm to her chest. She watched in horror as 4 bright red crescents on her skin quickly darkened into deep, angry purple bruises. Gloria didn't say a word. She simply reached down and smoothed the cuffs of her immaculate gray jacket, her face returning to its mask of serene, grandmotherly poise, while Marissa shook with the realization of the raw physical power hidden in that frail, aging frame. Later that evening, David sat frozen before his laptop in the small home office. Gloria stood behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder as she clicked play on a video file. On the screen, Marissa appeared in a silent, frantic dance, her arms swinging wildly toward Gloria's face. Because the audio had been stripped, the context, Marissa simply swatting away a persistent housefly that had been buzzing near them, was lost. What remained was a jagged, aggressive gesture that looked like a physical assault. David buried his face in his hands, a low groan escaping him. Gloria let out a heavy, theatrical sigh, pressing her palm to her heart as if the memory of the attack were too much to bear. When Marissa tried to interject, to explain the missing sound and the deceptive angle, David simply shook his head, refusing to look at her. The only sound in the room was the mechanical hum of the computer's cooling fan, a cold, repetitive noise that underscored the finality of the lie. In that digital record, Marissa was a monster, and Gloria was the fragile, long-suffering victim. The confrontation continued in the empty hallway an hour later. Gloria stepped into Marissa's path, blocking her way to the bedroom. The air around her smelled of sharp lavender soap, a scent that now made Marissa's stomach turn. Gloria leaned in, her voice a dry hiss against Marissa's ear. She whispered that a single click of a button would send the entire archive of concerning behavior to the school board. She lingered on phrases like psychological instability and unfit for the classroom, describing with chilling detail how quickly Marissa's career would disintegrate. Marissa felt the floor beneath her seem to tilt, the walls of the corridor blurring as a wave of vertigo hit her. Gloria promised that the cameras would stay exactly where they were, and that Marissa would learn to smile for every lens if she had any hope of keeping her job. Marissa slumped against the wall, the invisible noose of Gloria's control tightening around her throat, cutting off her ability to scream for help. Seeking even a moment of privacy, Marissa ducked into the bathroom and threw the bolt on the door. The metal gave an odd, hollow click that didn't feel right. She looked down and saw fresh, raw scratches in the wood around the lock. The old, sturdy brass latch had been replaced with a new one featuring a wide, oversized keyhole that offered a clear line of sight from the hallway. In the cracked mirror above the sink, Marissa caught a flicker of movement. Gloria's shadow passing through the gap under the door. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Gloria likely had a master key in her apron pocket, and there was no longer a single inch of the apartment where she could be truly alone. Marissa sank onto the edge of the rusted bathtub, wrapping her arms around her trembling shoulders. The rhythmic, muffled sound of Gloria's footsteps pacing just outside the door was a constant reminder that her sanctuary had been completely breached. That night, sleep was a heavy, unnatural thing. Marissa tried to force her eyelids open, but they felt as if they had been weighted with lead. A lingering, metallic bitterness from the tea Gloria had insisted on brewing after dinner coated her tongue. In the pale, watery moonlight, filtering through the blinds, Marissa saw a dark, motionless silhouette standing at the foot of the bed. Gloria was there, her hands clasped over her stomach, watching Marissa with an unblinking, predatory intensity. Marissa tried to cry out, to bolt upright, but her muscles refused to obey, paralyzed by whatever chemical agent was coursing through her blood. Gloria leaned forward slowly, her shadow stretching across the floral duvet until the silhouette of her sharp nose touched Marissa's chest. The room was deathly silent, save for the heavy, labored sound of Marissa's own breathing. She was a prisoner in her own body, a captive under the eternal silent watch of her mother-in-law. The next morning, the psychological torture took a more public turn. Marissa walked into the kitchen to find her private journals, books she had kept since college, spread out across the white tablecloth like a deck of cards. Gloria was sitting there, David across from her, as she read aloud in a clear, dispassionate voice. She chose passages where Marissa had vented about David's perceived weaknesses, his inability to stand up to his mother, and her own fears about their future. David sat perfectly still, his face draining of color with every word Gloria expertly stripped of its emotional context. Marissa watched her most private thoughts, her secret shames and frustrations, being dissected and displayed for the very person they were meant to be hidden from. Gloria tracked the most painful sentences with a long, sharp fingernail, systematically eroding the last foundations of trust in Marissa's marriage. Marissa stood in the doorway, stripped bare, unable to stop the public vivisection of her soul. When Marissa tried to push past them toward the front door, David stepped into her path, his hand extended in a firm, silent demand. In his eyes, Marissa saw a devastating mixture of pity and a new, hard-edged resolve that could only have come from his mother's counsel. He demanded her car keys, repeating Gloria's scripted lines about her unstable mental state and the clear danger she posed to herself and others on the road. Marissa's hand flew to her pocket, her fingers clenching the metal ring. But David didn't hesitate. He reached out and firmly pried her fingers open, his strength surprising her. Gloria watched from the shadows of the hallway, nodding in silent approval as the keys were transferred to David's pocket. The heavy clink of the metal sounded like a cell door slamming shut. Marissa's shoulders slumped as she realized her last means of escape had been severed. Gloria offered a small, terrifyingly triumphant smile, seeing her daughter-in-law finally broken and grounded in her own home. Marissa retreated to her phone, her thumb frantically tapping the screen to refresh her browser. But a sterile authorization error window popped up. Gloria glided past, neatly folding linen napkins, and remarked casually that the Wi-Fi password had been changed for network security. When Marissa reached for her phone on the side table, Gloria's hand intercepted it. She stated that a digital detox was exactly what Marissa needed to regain her equilibrium. Marissa looked down at her empty palms, a cold sense of isolation washing over her as she realized the world beyond these walls was being systematically erased. Gloria placed the phone in a dresser drawer and turned a small silver key. The sound of the lock clicking was, for Marissa, the final sentence of her isolation. She was now cut off from her friends, her colleagues, and any hope of outside intervention. Later that night, Marissa stood in the shadows of the dark hallway, watching Gloria at the front door. The silence was punctuated by the sharp, rhythmic sound of a roll of heavy gray duct tape being torn. The sound was like a knife through the quiet air. Gloria was meticulously taping over the edges of the door and the keyhole, smoothing the silver adhesive with her dry, methodical fingers. She wanted to ensure that no sound, no light, and no sliver of the outside world could penetrate their space. Gloria turned and, spotting Marissa in the darkness, allowed her lips to stretch into a slow, chilling smile of absolute victory. There was no warmth in the expression, only the cold light of a successful siege. Marissa understood then that the apartment was no longer a dwelling. It was a sealed vault, a space where every breath she took was now a gift from Gloria, and every exit was professionally, silently closed. Days bled into a blur of chemical fog and quiet terror. One afternoon, while Marissa was listlessly organizing the linen closet, one of the few tasks Gloria still allowed her, her fingers brushed against a hard, rectangular object sewn into the lining of the shelf. She ripped the seam open to find a tiny digital voice recorder. She pressed play, and her own voice filled the small space. But the cadence was wrong. The phrases, "I'm losing my mind," and "I need the medication," had been spliced together from various conversations, creating a haunting, artificial confession of insanity. A wave of pure horror crashed over her as she heard her own recorded laughter, unnaturally dubbed over a statement about seeing things that weren't there. Gloria had created a digital ghost, a piece of evidence ready to testify against Marissa's sanity at a moment's notice. The smell of burning paper began to drift into the living room shortly after. Marissa followed the scent to find Gloria standing by the fireplace, a match flickering in her hand. She held Marissa's blue leather-bound teaching license. Marissa lunged forward, but Gloria was faster, tossing the document into the heart of the flames. Marissa watched in stunned silence as the fire licked at the gold-embossed seal and the signatures that represented years of hard work and late-night studying. Gloria used a heavy iron poker to stir the embers, making sure the edges of Marissa's diploma were consumed. She looked at Marissa and stated calmly that without these papers, Marissa was nothing more than a shadow, a woman without a name or a profession. As the gray ash settled, Marissa felt her very identity being incinerated, leaving a black, hollow void where her future used to be. The financial trap snapped shut next. David sat at the kitchen table, a stack of legal documents spread before him. He wouldn't look at Marissa, his eyes fixed on the floor as he pointed to a signature line on a power of attorney form. Gloria stood directly behind him, her hands resting heavily on his shoulders, her fingers digging in as if she were a puppeteer directing his every move. David's voice was a strained whisper as he explained that since Marissa was spending impulsively and not herself, Gloria would be taking over their joint accounts. Marissa saw the clause that transferred all their shared savings into an account Gloria controlled. Gloria held out a pen, the cold metal casing glinting in the light. When Marissa took it, the contact felt like a burn. With a few strokes of ink, Marissa was officially rendered a penniless dependent in her own household, stripped of the means to buy even a loaf of bread without permission. Her physical health began to deteriorate under Gloria's care. Marissa tried to get out of bed one morning, but her legs felt like they were made of water, and the floor seemed to pitch and roll beneath her. Her eyes struggled to focus on the orange prescription bottle on the nightstand. She remembered it containing her daily vitamins, but now it was filled with dull, gray tablets she didn't recognize. She picked one up and snapped it. It released a bitter, almond-like scent and a sticky residue. Gloria entered the room with a tray, her eyes tracking every movement as she handed Marissa a glass of water. Marissa felt her tongue go numb almost instantly, her eyelids turning into heavy stone slabs. As she felt herself sliding back into a thick, chemical darkness, she saw Gloria meticulously tucking the blankets around her, a gesture of love that felt more like a burial. A few days later, a longtime family friend, Mrs. Evans, arrived for tea. Gloria was the picture of the devoted caregiver, smoothing the lace tablecloth and speaking in hushed, worried tones. As Marissa walked through the room, Gloria suddenly lurched to the side with a sharp, piercing shriek. She hit the floor with a heavy thud, purposefully overturning a chair as she went down. Gloria clutched her side, her face contorted in a mask of simulated agony, as she pointed a trembling finger at the bewildered Marissa. Mrs. Evans gasped in horror, and David came running from the hallway. Marissa stood frozen, watching the performance with a sense of detachment. Gloria sobbed, claiming Marissa had snapped and attacked her without provocation. In David's eyes, Marissa saw the final flicker of trust extinguish, replaced by a cold, distant fear. The reputation she had spent a lifetime building was dismantled in a single, choreographed fall, driven by a sudden, desperate clarity. Marissa waited until the house was quiet and slipped down into the damp, narrow basement. In the furthest corner, behind a stack of rusted garden tools, she found a heavy wooden trunk bound in a thick, oxidized chain. She grabbed a rusted crowbar and heaved, the lock snapping with a sharp, metallic crack. Inside, buried under moth-eaten clothes, was a folder of yellowed newspaper clippings from 20 years ago. The headlines were a punch to the gut. Mystery disappearance of local wife. It was the first wife of Gloria's late husband, a woman named Helen who had vanished from this very house. Marissa stared at the old photos. The woman had the same haunted look in her eyes, and in the background of one photo stood the same oak dresser that now blocked Marissa's path. Gloria was in every picture, a silent shadow in the background with that same triumphant, icy gaze. Marissa realized then that she wasn't just a victim. She was a sequel. A sharp creak on the basement stairs made her head whip around. But she was too late. The heavy oak door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a finality that vibrated in the floorboards. She heard the heavy thud of the external bolt being thrown. Then, the hum of the basement light bulb flickered and died as Gloria hit the main breaker. Absolute suffocating darkness swallowed the room. Marissa threw herself against the door, her fists bruising against the wood. But Gloria's laughter drifted through the cracks, a soft, melodic sound. Gloria whispered through the wood that silence was the only cure for Marissa's hysteria. Marissa slumped against the door, the smell of damp earth and old dust filling her nose. As Gloria's footsteps faded away, Marissa was left alone in the dark with the ghosts of the women who had come before her. Hours passed in the lightless void. Marissa crawled across the freezing concrete floor, her hands sweeping through piles of discarded junk until her fingers brushed against a familiar shape. David's old smartphone, discarded months ago when the screen cracked. She felt the jagged glass, but the device emitted a faint, miraculous beep. She searched the darkness with frantic intensity until she found a portable power bank among the spare parts. With trembling fingers, she connected the wires by feel, and a weak, blue glow illuminated the cobwebs around her. The battery was at 1%. She struggled to dial the emergency number, her breath shallow and fast. Every creak of the floorboards above her sounded like a death knell. She pressed the phone to her ear, praying for a dial tone in the underground tomb, her entire existence hanging by a single, flickering digital thread. Above her, she heard David's voice, hesitant and muffled. He was standing near the basement door. Marissa opened her mouth to scream, but before she could, she heard Gloria's voice, a soft, hypnotic murmur. Gloria was telling him that the noises he heard were just his imagination, a byproduct of the incredible stress he was under. She convinced him that Marissa was upstairs, safely asleep under the influence of her nerves medication. Marissa heard the rustle of paper. Gloria was showing him a brochure for a private sanitarium, insisting that for Marissa's own safety, a transport team should take her away that very night. David wavered, his footsteps pausing. But Gloria's influence was a physical weight, pulling him away toward the living room. She turned up the volume on the record player, and the swelling notes of a classical symphony drowned out Marissa's desperate scratching at the door. Desperation gave Marissa a strength she didn't know she possessed. She spotted a narrow, grime-encrusted ventilation window near the ceiling. She hauled herself up onto a stack of old crates, the wood groaning under her. She smashed the glass with a crowbar and squeezed through the tiny opening, the jagged edges tearing at her skin and clothes. She tumbled out into the wet grass of the backyard and stayed low, creeping toward the glowing living room window. Inside, Gloria was at the bar, her back to David. Marissa watched in horror as Gloria opened a white capsule and emptied a fine powder into David's glass of scotch. The powder vanished into the amber liquid instantly. Gloria turned with a saintly smile and handed the glass to David, urging him to drink it to settle his heart. Marissa's pulse hammered in her ears. Gloria wasn't just neutralizing her. She was preparing to lobotomize David's will entirely. Marissa didn't think. She acted. She burst through the back door, her sudden appearance a blur of torn clothing and bloodied skin. She reached David just as the glass touched his lips, her hand sweeping out to knock it from his grasp. The glass shattered against the floor, amber liquid soaking into the rug. Gloria let out a sound that wasn't human, a guttural hiss, and lunged at Marissa, her fingers curved like talons. Marissa caught the older woman's wrists, the two of them grappling in a desperate struggle. With a surge of adrenaline, Marissa shoved Gloria back onto the sofa. She reached under the cushions and yanked out the hidden tablet. She smashed the screen against the edge of the oak table, and as the device flickered in its death throes, a folder of audio files opened. Marissa hit the speaker icon. Gloria's voice filled the room, cold and calculating, discussing the exact dosage of sedatives needed to keep the girl compliant. David went deathly pale, his gaze shifting from the tablet to his mother, whose face was now a jagged landscape of exposed malice. David looked at his mother as if she were a stranger, a monster he had been sharing his life with. His hand moved toward the phone on the wall, his intention clear. Gloria tried to scramble toward him, to weave one last lie, but Marissa stepped between them, her posture iron-willed. She walked to the front door and threw it wide, the cold Chicago night air rushing in. She grabbed Gloria's suitcase from the hallway and hurled it out onto the porch, her arm pointing toward the street. Gloria stood on the threshold, her eyes burning with a silent, concentrated hatred. But the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Under Marissa's unwavering gaze, the older woman retreated into the darkness. Marissa slammed the door and threw the heavy bolt, then took a roll of tape and sealed the lock herself. A final act of closure. In the sudden, profound quiet of the house, Marissa and David stood together, listening to the fading sound of Gloria's footsteps as she vanished into the night. The siege was over,